Welcome to Artistry Viewer. I am Lydia Kimeu from SOS Technical Training Institute in Buruburu. I will take you through the making of a sleeveless fitted dress for the ladies. For you to make this dress, you will need to take measurements in the first place, and you will take the body measurements of your clients. You will need the measurement of the shoulders, which will facilitate you to get that fitting. You will need to take the bust measurement around the fullest part of the bust. You will need to take the waist measurement and the hip measurement, which is around the fullest part of the hip of your client. You will also need the body's measurement from the shoulder to the waist and from the shoulder to the full length or the final length of that garment. Once you have taken those measurements, then we need to analyze the details that are on this dress. The first detail we notice is the neckline. This is our neckline. If you look at the neckline carefully, you realize that that neckline is a U shape. We call it the U shape or scooped neckline. That means from the usual neckline, we need to lower our neckline slightly more. Then we have, at the front, we have two darts. That's that, and this line there, that's what we are calling the dart. A dart is a fold of fabric that is pointed, and in this case, it is pointed twice at the top and at the bottom, and we call that a double pointed dart. In the front, we see no other detail, but there is something that is hidden, and this is the facing, which is used to finish the neckline and the armhole. A facing is simply a fabric that has been attached to that opening, and it is the one that is used to finish that particular opening. And in this particular case, we will use a facing known as a combined facing. The combined facing is simply a facing that is for the neckline and for the armhole put together as one facing. Then at the back, we see the details that are there. The neckline is the usual back neckline. We have the two darts, which is this. And we also have a zip. And the method we shall use to attach that zip is known as the lapped or concealed zip. Similarly, down there, that is a slit or a vent, which is supposed to allow us to walk as we wear the garment. As we go into the drafting or the cutting out of the garment, there are lines that we need to establish. The line I have just drawn is called the center front line, initialed as CF, and that just denotes the center of the front part of that person. The line at the back, this one here, is the center back line, which divides the back into two equal parts. We also need to know our bust line. The line that I have drawn is the waistline, and the hip line. Those are where we will apply the measurements that we took. And then from the top or from the shoulder to the waist, and from the shoulder to the length of the garment. From there, we will proceed into cutting out the garment, where I shall instruct you on how to do it. Now, before we go there, we will require interfacing, which is what we will apply to the facing of the garment. And this is our interfacing. And we will require 1/2 meter of this. We will also require a zip, which is 18 inches long, and we will require the fabric, which is 2 1/4 meters long, and it is 45 inches wide. If you have a fabric that is 60 inches wide, you will require 1 1/2 meters. So we can move to the cutting section and now see how we will cut our garment. Having taken the measurements, open up your fabric or your material. You will notice that there is an edge that is completely finished that has no threads showing. We refer to that as the selvage. Now that forms the length of the garment. So fold your fabric and you will fold this fabric equally. The measurement of 1/4 of the hip, because it is the widest part, and then 1/4 the hip plus seam allowance. That means with a hip of 40, 1/4 of 40 is 10. 10 plus 1 inch seam allowance gives us 11. So measure out 11 inches. Equally on the length. Ensure that it is 11 throughout. You can do so by taking the measurement at intervals. And right, we have our 11 inches. From that, for you to place the shoulder, having taken the shoulder measurement, measure half the shoulder being 15, half of 15 is 7 1/2, plus 1/2 inch seam allowance, that gives us 8. 7 1/2 plus 1/2, 8, and draw a straight line. Then, from the top, to establish the bust line, it is 1/4 of the bust, which is 38. 1/4 of 38 is 9 1/2, plus seam allowance of the shoulder, and that will be 1/2 inch. So 9 1/2 plus 1/2 gives us 10. Measure 10 at the center front and at the side. To establish the bust line, measure from the top. To establish the waistline, we have established the bust line. This is our bust line. To establish the waistline, you will require the body's measurement, which is 16, plus the 1/2 inch seam allowance gives us 16 1/2. This is the measurement from the waist to from the shoulder to the waist. Then, to establish the hip line, we measure from the waistline 8 inches down. Draw a straight line. And now we need to establish the length of the garment. Here we will have to add 2 seam allowances. That is the one for the shoulder and the one for the hem down. That means with a length of 42 inches, it will be 42 plus half, that is 42 and a half, plus 2 inches, it gives us 44 and a half. So measure out your 44 and a half. And draw your hemline. Remember to mark your hem allowance, which is 2 inches. Now, we need to draw our neckline and our shoulder. Remember we said that the neckline is scooped, and with a scooped neckline, we will go down from the top 5 inches. On a normal neckline, we would have gone down 3 inches. Then the width of the neckline, we will measure 3 inches. On a normal neckline, we would have measured 2.5. And then we draw our neckline. Remember to curve. And that should be a perfect curve. Then, to establish the shoulder, we will lower from the top 1.25 inches on the line that we drew for the shoulder, which is what we call the arm side or shoulder line, and draw our slanted line. By so doing, we have established the neck. Now we need to establish the side seam, which is the line or the stitching line that is on the side. And we will do so by first establishing our bust measurement. And taking our bust measurement, that means 38 divided by 4 gives us 9.5, plus a seam allowance of 1 inch, that is 10.5. We will take the same measurement of 10.5 at the waistline and mark in the seam allowance. Then, remember our hip is wider than the bust. It is a hip of 40 inches. Therefore, 40 divided by 4 gives us 10, plus the seam allowance, it gives us 11. Measure the same 11 at the hem of the dress. Then now you're ready to join or draw your side seam. From the waist to the hip, it is a slanted line. And then from the hip to the hem, it is a straight line. We now need to draw our darts, the double-pointed darts, and we shall draw them at the center. We'll take the measurement from the center front line, which is that line, to the side seam, without including the seam allowance, on the waistline position. And that is 9.5 divided by 2. It gives us 4 3/4. We will take that measurement on the bust line too, 4 3/4, and at the hip line, 4 3/4. Draw a straight line. The dart from the waist to the bust line will be 5 inches. And similarly, from the waist to towards the hip line, it will be 5 inches in terms of length. Now, for the width of the dart, we realize that the difference from the waistline and the bust line, we have a difference of 4 inches. Therefore, this 4 inches divided by 4 gives us 1 inch. It is this 1 inch that we shall now take as our dart measurement. The dart is a method of controlling fullness. Draw your dart. It is supposed to give good fitting or make the garment fit at the waistline, because the waistline is never the same as the hip. And with that, we have drawn, or we have come far in terms of drafting our garment. Now we need to draw in or now shape our armhole. How will we do that? We will take the measurement from the shoulder point to the bust line, and this one is 8.5 inches. Divided by 2, we have 4.25 inches. At that point of 4.25 inches, take half an inch and mark. That is where the curve of the armhole should pass. And then from the bust line upwards, measure 1.5 inches. Now, as we sketch, you need to sketch, as we draw the armhole, you need to measure from the bust line up half an inch, which is your seam allowance, and curve. Remember, as we did the shoulder line, we had already added seam allowance. Make sure your curve goes through those points and back to the shoulder point. With that, we are done with the front, and we can now cut. With this, we have now cut the front piece for our dress. We will now fold the back for our dress. Remember that you need to put your right sides together and still using the straight grain of the fabric. Fold it. We are going to use the front piece to cut out the back of our dress. Ensure that your fabric lies flat. Yeah. Now, this center front, if you remember our design very well, we had a zip at the back and we also had a slit. So to the front, we need to add allowances for the slit and for the pleat, and therefore we shall add 2 inches and extend it from the center front line of the front piece. When we go to the back, the center front becomes the center back. Draw your line, ensure that it is straight. ensure that the fold lines lie together. This is what we are calling the fold line. And trace out. Do not cut directly. Where's my chalk? Do not cut directly, but trace out the armhole shape, the shoulder, and the neckline. We say that our facing is a combined facing, meaning it will face both the neckline. And trace out 3 inches of the side seam. Take your measurement to ensure that it is 3 inches. And carve. At the neckline too, 3 inches. And carve. So that is the shape of your combined facing. To avoid that point, just carve out to the front. Okay? After that, cut out your facing. Yeah, and that is our front facing. For you to cut the back, my piece has fallen down. For you to cut the back, fold. Remember, the back is wider than the front because of the slit allowance that we put. Fold your piece and place your back. And once again, trace out. Do not cut directly. Trace out your neckline. Trace out your center back. Trace out your shoulder. And your armhole. And the side seam. Move your back piece and measure your 3 inches once again. This too has got to be equal to the front. If you choose to have a facing that is wider, make sure it is equal to the front. Draw the outline of your facing and your neckline. To avoid the sharp end, because it will be a problem to finish, carve that too. After which, you can now cut out your facing and we shall be ready for stitching. Now remember, we said that facings are used to finish the neckline and the armhole, which, as the garment is being worn, they receive a lot of pressure because of that, and as they are being cleaned, they are agitated or rubbed more. Therefore, to strengthen these areas, we add interfacing, or what is commonly known as gum canvas, to the facings, and in this case, we shall use the iron-on interfacing. Therefore, the first procedure will be to interface our gum canvas, our facings, and also transfer our darts onto the other parts of the dress. Lay your pieces properly. And the easiest way is to use your scissor and hit. The mark will imprint itself on the other pieces. You can also use the dressmaker's carbon and a tracing wheel. You can see the mark, make sure you put it there. Here is the back. In the industry, we use a hot needle that pierces through and forms a hole. And with that, we have marked our darts. We are now ready to go for ironing. Fold your pieces well so that you don't lose any, and go for your ironing. Before you go for your ironing, you can cut out your interfacing. The front is on fold, so just fold your interfacing and place your front piece. And we are ready to go for ironing. Now, if you look at the interfacing before we go for ironing, you will realize that there is a part that actually is shining and there is a dull part. Now, with the iron-on interfacing, the area that is shining is actually the gum that holds the interfacing onto the facing. Therefore, this is the part that you shall iron next to the facing, and you will place your iron on the dull side. After you have cut the interfacing, you now need to iron the interfacing onto the fabric or onto the facing. So open up your facing. This is the front facing. You can see it has the fold line, no seam at the center front. Place the shiny part of the facing onto the wrong side of the front facing or main garment. With that well placed, take your iron. The iron has different levels of heat. Being tetron, which is a mixture of polyester and cotton, then we can use the temperature of wool, and that's about 3 or 2, depending on the kind of iron. You will see the indicators. And now start your ironing. Wrong sides on top, that means the right sides lie on the facing. They are supposed to be opposite each other. If they are not, then there is a mistake. After ironing your seam open, we are now ready to start working on our zip, and we will be using the method commonly known as the lapped zip or the concealed method. We start off with the left hand side, roll off 0.6 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. Place your zip. and stitch close to the fold line. As beginners, you might want to tuck. Ensure that you roll off the 0.6 or the 1/8 of an inch all through and stitch. Start by edge stitching. Start by reverse stitching. And continue stitching. Turn your seam, your facing to the right side. And knife edge. Press your seam allowances towards the facing and have your facing up and your seam allowances on the underside, then understitch. This means you will be stitching the seam allowances to the facing as you pull the seam away. Ensure that your seam allowances are under and stitch close to the stitching line. Reverse stitch at the beginning and at the end. And you will see that the facing now lies flat on the neckline. Do the same for the back facing, for the back neckline. And for the back, you will have to open your zip. Place the neckline together. And the 2 inches seam allowance goes on the inside, like I have placed it. But remember to edge stitch the center back seam that had not been edge stitched. Just fold. Stitch the other side. And then now we can attach the back neckline to the back of the facing. Fold the 2 inches towards the wrong side and stitch on the neckline only. Remember the seam allowance of 1/2 inch. Your neckline is curved, so curve your seam and retain the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Do the same to the other side of the back. And once again, also remember to snip. This will allow the curve to relax and be able to turn. Reduce your seam allowance. Now turn. You will realize that the zip has been caught. And we can now do our understitching. Holding the seam allowances to the facing from the right side. And also understitch the other side. Now we can work on the armholes. Match the side seams. And stitch. Okay, we now go to the armhole. Place your seams together. And remember, we put a seam allowance of 1/2 inch. Stitch. Ensure that your side seams for the facing and the main garment meet, and stitch around the armhole. Maintaining your 1/2 inch seam allowance. Do the same for the other armhole too. Opening your seam allowances at the side seam. Place your pieces together and stitch. Ensure your garment lies flat. And keep the seam allowance of 1/2 inch. Trim off your thread as you work. All curved seams always have to be snipped. So we will also snip the armhole seam. Remember, it is curved. And trim any excess seam allowance. As you trim off the seam allowance, you're reducing on the bulk at that particular seam. Trim it off to 1/4 inch. Turn your facing to the wrong side. You will also need to understitch the facing, but you can only do so up to a point for the armhole. After understitching, press and knife edge your armhole seam. You are now ready to put the shoulder seam together. Have the back and the front. Turn your back seam allowance or your back shoulder to the wrong side. Insert your front shoulder into the back. Ensure it comes in between. Align or make sure the seam allowances lie together and stitch. The seam allowance we left at the shoulder point was 1/2 inch. Cut off and do the same for the other side. This is how the seam should look once you have made it. Now insert the other side, turn the back to the wrong side and insert the front into the back, neckline to neckline and side and armhole to armhole. Let the seam allowances lie together. And stitch. Turn, and our shoulder is made. Cut off any seam allowances, any threads. And our garment is made. Now neaten your seam allowances, your facing edge, neaten your facing edge. Use the edge stitching method too. If you have an overlock, you can use the overlock to neaten your seam allowance or your edge, facing edge. At the curved area, ensure you just take the 1/4 inch and hold the edge down. When you come to the side seam, open up the seam and knit when the seam is open. Go around the whole edge of the seam allowance. fold the edge at the center back line. Cut off your thread. And your garment is made. We will now do the hem. Turn the garment to the right side. And at the hem, you see we folded the 2 inches seam allowance. We shall turn it around and stitch the hem allowance, which was 2 inches. Measure it out. And stitch. This will only be done to the right hand side of the back. Fold the edge of the hem from the left hand side, the 2 inches, and hold it down by folding a quarter on the inside. This hem is usually done by hand, but we shall do it by machine today. Keep measuring your hem allowance. Ensure the hem lies flat. When you get to the seam allowance, ensure the seam allowances match. And you open your seam allowance. Do not stitch when it is closed. Stitch all the way to the edge of the right hand side. Now, all we are left to do is iron the garment, and our garment is complete. Trim off any extra or any hanging threads, and finally give your garment a good press. At the facing, hold down the facing using hand stitches, and our garment is complete. This is our final product for the dress we have been making. This is the way your dress should look. I have been your presenter, Lydia Kimeu, from SOS Technical Training Institute, Buruburu. See you next time.